The appearance of an apparition in George Street in Edinburgh caused a stir in the early 20th century. A young woman, elegantly dressed, was seen walking in the street in broad daylight, wearing clothes from another century. She wore a dark blue coat and skirt, trimmed with black braid, with the collar of the coat turned over, showing a blue velvet facing. The sleeves were very full at the shoulders, and a band of blue velvet held it tightly at the young woman's waist. She also wore a small hat with 2 feathers, one white and one blue, white gloves, patent leather shoes with silver buckles and moderate heels, a fine blue silk openwork pair of stockings, and a gold bracelet that dangled over her gloves. What also drew the witnesses' attention to her was her yellow hair and extremely pale complexion. Wishing to get a better look at her, he quickened his steps and overtook her, although a chill ran through him as he did so. When he glanced back, he saw what he described as the face of the dead. He slowed and allowed her to pass him. He wasn't the only person to experience her that day. 1 or 2 people who walked past her seemed to shiver as they did so, but neither slowed down to look at her. He continued following the woman along George Street to the junction of Dundas Street, and as she and the witness were about to cross, an elderly gentleman walked right through her. The man thought the elderly gent would apologise to her, but no, he hadn't even noticed her. In turn, the apparition walked right through the old man. Slightly further on, the lady stopped and entered a chemist shop, and the witness followed her in. He couldn't have been more than 6 feet behind her, when she suddenly vanished. He asked the chemist if he'd seen the lady, but he hadn't, and laughed, asking the man what he was talking about. He then asked what he'd come in for, so being polite, the man made a purchase. That night he dreamt of the ghost, and in that dream she told him her name was Jane. A few days later, the man found himself in George Street again, but this time the weather was foul, with the rain lashing down. Many of those he passed were wearing mackintoshes and carrying huge umbrellas, but he was drenched, his boots saturated to their tops, his trousers no better. Then he spotted Jane. She had suddenly appeared as he was passing the Ladies' Tea Association rooms, walking in front of him, wearing the same clothes as before, but completely dry, as if the rain daren't touch her. Wanting a closer look at her, he darted past her, turned round and looked at her face. When he saw in horror her dead white face, he went reeling across the pavement in shock and fear. But his fascination with the woman got the better of him, and he followed her once more. At the time, cars were more popular than hansom cabs and horses, but there was one on George Street that day, and as she passed, the horse shied away. As Jane approached another junction, there happened to be a police officer directing the traffic. He became at least the second witness to see this ghostly apparition. When he clapped eyes on her, his face filled with terror. His eyes bulged, his cheeks lost all colour, his chest heaved, and his hands dropped. Had it not been for a kindly passer-by from a nearby pub, he would have dropped to the ground. Meanwhile, Jane went to the chemist's shop once more, where again she disappeared. By this time, the man knew he wasn't imagining things, so made inquiries about the young woman. It transpired that around 18 years before she returned to George Street as an apparition, the chemist shop had belonged to a Miss Bosworth, and he tracked her down to Bournemouth, where she'd retired to, and asked the woman if she knew of a Jane that looked like the ghost he'd seen. After a long pause, the woman asked him pointedly, "Is she still there? I thought she'd surely be at rest now." Miss Bosworth then told him what he wanted to know. In 1892, an advert had been placed in a local paper by a Miss Jane Vernelt, going by the name Mademoiselle Vernelt, who was a dressmaker and costumier in George Street, who wished to sell her business. These premises were in the very building now occupied by the chemist. Miss Vernelt wanted a large sum of money for her business, but having looked at the accounts and some of the clientele she had, Miss Bosworth agreed to purchase it, and within a week was running it. However, a month later, Miss Vernelt returned to the shop in an agitated state, stating its sale had all been a mistake. She told Miss Bosworth, "I didn't want to sell it. I can't do anything with my capital. Let me buy it back." Miss Bosworth told her that in the short time she'd had it, the business had expanded, and she had no intention of selling it back, at least not for a while. Miss Vernelt caused so much fuss, shouting and screaming at the woman, that Miss Bosworth had to call her assistants to eject her from the premises. Every day for 6 weeks after this, the young woman would return, and in the end Miss Bosworth had to take out legal proceedings against her. She then discovered the truth. Miss Vernelt was deranged and had been suffering from softening of the brain, what we'd now call dementia, for months. It was on medical advice that she'd been told to give up the business and put herself in the care of a relative or friend, who in turn would see that her money was invested on her behalf. However, she delayed doing this, and when she finally did, it was too much for her. With her deterioration, she believed she was ruined. According to Miss Bosworth, the hauntings had begun shortly before she died, and she too saw her gliding in and out of the shop. After she died, the apparition appeared for several weeks, and then there was nothing until the man had told her that he'd seen her. The ghost of Jane hasn't been reported in recent years, but as you walk along George Street, if you feel a shiver while you're walking, it'll only be Jane making her way back to her shop. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.